Hello and welcome to Nat and B Talk About History. Today's topic will be the Vietnam War, and we're going to be talking specifically about whether the Vietnam War was necessary or a mistake.
So I'm just going to read off some points really fast that we're going to be discussing.
And this is going to be based off of Gary R. Hess's Vietnam, Explaining America's Lost War.
So, number one, Vietnam had become a critical point of Cold War confrontation because of commitments by the U.S. and the major communist powers to the South Vietnamese and North Vietnamese governments, respectively.
What does that even mean? So it's definitely an argument for why the Cold War was necessary.
Yeah.
Vietnam had become a critical point of Cold War confrontation. Doesn't that seem kind of like... It's a critical point because we made it a critical point?
It's a little vague, I think. Vietnam had become a critical point of Cold War confrontation. I mean, their explanation just was because of commitments by the U.S. and the major communist powers to the South Vietnamese. So to me it sounds like it was a confrontation because we were committed to it. Which is
not true, because the conflict existed before we were even there. I mean, like, the Vietnam War, as we refer to it, is the second Indochina War to, like, the Vietnamese, you know?
Right.
Because we kind of took the help from the French after it didn't work out for them.
I think it was more about the when they talk about the major communist players, I think it had to do with that. It was more so that their support was almost a threat, or the way we saw it, it was a threat to our national well-being, just because we have two ideologies balancing, and ultimately the way we saw it and the communist players saw it was that only one ideology could be on top. So if they were to take Vietnam, it would be a threat to our own American ideals, is the way that I think.
I can see that
being.
And I think especially at the time, like, they don't have the benefit of retrospect, and so this was a genuine fear for them.
Right.
Okay, so the next one is the Soviet Union and China, emboldened by recent developments, became more expansionist and opportunistic. I think I would agree with that.
I would agree with that, but then I would also say that I think it leaves out our own sense of expansionism at the time too. We weren't really expanding, but I don't think we can play the role of just kind of like the standbyers trying to, keep
like some antagonistic force at bay,
right.
Where we ourselves were
pretty antagonist. I mean, you see in Latin America what we were doing there.
Yeah.
Cuban Missile Crisis, with JFK, Bay of Pigs, and all. So I don't know how anti-conflict we were at the time. I feel like we were also kind of trying to spread our own influence in our own way.
I think what they're arguing here, though, might be that, because both parties were more aggressive and more expansionist and willing to take on larger risks, that's what made Vietnam a little bit more important, contributing to how choosing to get involved would be a necessary choice.
Right.
I don't buy it, but it makes sense logically.
I definitely agree with that. At the time, it seemed like this was critical to everything we were standing for.
Oh, look at that. You used the word for the next one. Vietnam was critical.
There we go.
Was a critical domino whose loss to communism would undermine non-communist governments in neighboring countries, with especially significant results in an unstable Indonesia.
That one I think I agree with the most, I guess, with reasons for why we got involved. I think to me that would be a really heavy hitter. It was just the idea of the domino theory. It was something that everybody had bought into.
Do you think, I don't know, because we lost China, or Truman lost China to communism in 49 or something like that? So,
the Korean War.
And after China was lost, it's not like every country around it also flipped and turned communist,
Right.
So do you think that maybe that's evidence that the domino theory was always flawed, or is that something that kind of encouraged the idea of preserving what ground we had?
I think the domino theory, again, with retrospect, it was flawed, but I think at the time, I think it was a real fear because of just the Soviets, I guess, just their push for their ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed like to them, or to the U.S., I feel like it was seen as though if their ideals spread, it can only diminish ours. So I think they saw it as the more communist parties they get to their side, the less support they get to the West. So I think it was kind of like there was no balance. It would be one will prevail and one will falter. And I think it was kind of
like this like idea of a zero-sum game in terms of like, political ideologies. And I guess it's really scary, you know?
Right, yeah. Right, because it was just like...
So, I guess with the argument that the war was necessary, it makes sense. Like, all of the conclusions that they made were logical. I just don't think that they hold up, you know, in terms of like what we've seen now. I mean, we're looking back at it and seeing that like, yeah, we lost Vietnam and nothing too crazy happened, you know?
Right.
So it's hard to really give these ideas credibility when like they were clearly incorrect. But I guess at the time they made sense and it was reasonable.
Yeah.
So we've also got some arguments here as to why it wasn't necessary and Vietnam was just straight up a mistake. So the first one is that the U.S. erroneously broadened the containment doctrine to include a region of secondary interest. So I'm going to paraphrase that to say that Vietnam didn't really matter that much in terms of like our containment policy. I think I'd buy. I mean, like, I think the hot spots would have been like what, Europe? Right. And that's where we really did focus our energies, like with the Marshall Plan and rebuilding, and like that was a huge hot spot for us. And I think that would make it the primary interest in that Vietnam. I mean, I know these aren't like the same time frame, like it goes kind of like Europe and then Asia.
Right.
But I would agree that Vietnam is probably not the most important area of interest for us at the time.
I mean, I think this also goes to like our areas of interest didn't necessarily. We were focused on things that were happening, you know, overseas that we felt could be, again, just like a danger to, I mean, it was just the Red Scare, I mean, communism was on the rise and it was just freaking everybody out. And so I think, again, we saw it as we need to help in like kind of like the American, almost be like the world superpower. It was our duty to kind of go in and to help those who wanted to be free democratic nations who were being kind of suppressed by the communists. I think that was, we made that a vital interest. But then again, how much that goes to containment or kind of backing up what we had said we were going to do.
Like, it's a really admirable like sentiment,
right.
But was it enough to justify
the
Vietnam War, our involvement? Okay, so the next one is that the American doctrines include that the American effort to engage in nation building in South Vietnam defied Vietnamese history and stood little chance of success. That one, I think, is probably the most valid point he makes in this entire book. I think there are so many examples of how we completely disregard what the Vietnamese people really wanted. I mean, we supported Diem and like everybody hated him. He was a Catholic in a Buddhist nation and he just was straight up not a good dude in general.
American effort to engage in nation building defied Vietnamese. Yeah, I mean, that just goes into, like, from the beginning, were we fighting a war or were we rebuilding a government and a nation? And it seems like we couldn't effectively do both. And so we had to choose whether or not we were going to invest, like, our interest in fighting the war or in rebuilding the nation. And I think we focused on fighting the war, which then in turn kind of nation building got put on the back burner, which we could see when we start to transition from Americanization to Vietnamization. You can kind of see that. I think that once we realized the war was unwinnable, it was like, okay, we're out. And
I think there are a lot of people that realized the war was probably a lost cause pretty early on, like 65 even, like with McNamara.
But then I think that, I mean, this would be a different argument for a different podcast, but I think that that ties into what, was it a lost cause from the beginning, or did we make it one? Like, was it, like, was there ever...
Like, was there a way for us to win?
Right. And that's a whole, separate argument. But, I think that's also important to take into account. I think...
Wait, what do you think is the answer to that question? Because I personally believe that, like, there's not a chance. If, like, by win, we, like, had set up, like, a democratic government there with, like, a full capitalist system, everything's fine, communism, no threat, unified Vietnam, everything. Whole nine works. Don't think that was a possibility.
I think if it was more of a conventional warfare, and I think if Johnson's foreign policy, I don't think really did any favors to, the Vietnamese people at
I
all.
feel so bad for LBJ.
Yeah.
I always, whenever I think about him, I think about that song the protesters sang that was like, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?
Yeah.
Like, yikes.
Which is almost ironic because he, like, when you look at his foreign policy compared to Nixon's, it was just, I mean, Rolling Thunder was a joke. Everyone knows that. So, like,
I mean, it was a good attempt. Like,
but right, it did like
they were trying to use air power, which like
yeah,
is
Then-
reasonable,
yeah.
you know, like in
Then you
terms
have-
of because the ground power wasn't working.
yeah. Then you have Nixon who comes in and just completely. I mean, his like goal was to just pretty much bomb the hell out of them, and so he did that, and then that's
Poor
what brought
Cambodia.
him back to the peace table. So it's just kind of like that was a more quick and decisive end to the war. But then again, they saw LBJ as a warmonger when in comparison to Nixon, he wasn't at all.
So do you think that like if we had done things differently, we could have won?
It depends what you're defining as winning, because like you're saying that like build like we have a democratic nation with this government, and I think that might be of a stretch, but I think that we could have successfully kept
Defeated the Vietnam.
defeated the Vietnam. I think we could have kept North Vietnam at bay, and I think we could have established like South Vietnam as like an independent nation, and then whatever
We had just done things
if
differently.
we just done things differently, and then
In
whatever
terms of like foreign policy, like diplomatically, or like military leadership, like what we chose to do.
I think foreign policy, because that trickled down to military leaders. I mean, LBJ's Target Tuesdays kind of
He's scared, bro.
took away all power from military leaders. So I think that it was a matter of foreign policy that ended up trickling down. So I think if we would have had a different approach there, I think the war could have been winnable in terms of just keeping Vietnam at bay and defeating them. But
It was totally off topic.
yeah, that was a nice little rant.
Okay, so the next one is that the concern with credibility reflected shortcomings of U.S. policy in any event depends more on sound judgment, not mindless adherence to an untenable position. So miscalculations and poor judgment thus propelled the U.S. towards war. I think this is basically arguing that it was an accident, that it was just our basic incompetence, that like our misunderstanding of the will of the Vietnamese people, of what we could potentially accomplish militarily, and like how valid containment really was, that caused the war.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of see exactly. I think that just goes back to what we've kind of been saying. It was that at the time it sounded okay, but then when we think about it, we'd be like, how sound was their judgment? Like, what the things they were basing this off of? How accurate were they? And again, now we can see that again, like
They were super not accurate.
right, like you explained, like we lost South Vietnam, and then we were like everything was fine, like it wasn't the world.
Russia didn't win.
The world didn't end, but
the Soviet Union, my bad.
yeah, but so I don't know. I think that's also a really sound argument. That I think that how sound, I guess, were the judgments and like the logical fallacies. In general.
But I will say that, like, given the context, like, what information they had at the time, all of their decisions made sense. Like, they were reasonable, and it wasn't just, like, some part of, like, a craze to me. I feel like they were all very calculated and intentional.
Yeah.
So I don't want to call it just pure incompetence, you know? I would err on the side of calling it a mistake over a necessity. But it was a mistake driven by the idea that it was a necessity.
At the time, right?
Yeah.
So, like, again, like, at the time, necessary. Hindsight, mistake.
Yeah.
Settle on that?
Yeah. Nice.
Okay.
So that was me and Natalie settling the debate.
Once and for all, history can sleep soundly tonight.